My friendship with Moses is a friendship rooted in a sense of connection I feel not so much with his ideas as with his experiences of life, beginning with his earliest experiences in the womb and as a little child. I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. Moses and the Inner Child. Well, before I get to all that, I want to actually open this episode with some comments about something having to do with how different in style the episodes with Moses have been compared to what I did with my friends John and the Buddha, for those of you who've been following along. The portion of John that I explored in the early episodes were from a poetic prologue, and that genre determined how I went about presenting the insights I was getting from John. The Buddha material is drawn from actual discourses, didactic teaching, and you could think of that genre as a sort of spoken essay, which, of course, would determine the kind of presentation I would make about the ideas discovered there. Both genres, whether poetry or oral essay, are art forms, and they require creativity and a sensitivity to an audience, and they require that as we interpret them. But my approach with those first two friends was more focused on interpretation and explanation of the sort of cognitive conceptual world of ideas that they were trying to communicate. The Moses material is a very different creative genre than either John or the Buddha. It's a narrative, and the closest equivalence I can suggest to such a narrative to describe the kind of genre that it is it's sort of a mixture of epic myth and historical novel. And that means that much of my approach to the interpretation of the Moses material is aimed at imaginative engagement with the scenes and the characters in the story. With all three of these friends, in spite of their different genres, I've looked at certain questions. What's real? What went wrong? And how to fix it? Those really were questions that John and the Buddha sort of put on the table as I invited them into my house to have a conversation. And as such, those three questions have shaped how I'm looking at Genesis, which is the book that provides the background to the actual Moses story. So, in relationship to those three questions, what's real, what went wrong, and how to fix it, so far in previous episodes related to Moses and Genesis, here's what we've seen. Related to what is real, there's a divine creator presented in very anthropomorphic terms, which, while sometimes is criticized, that anthropomorphism, criticized as a sort of crude and unsophisticated picture of God, does have the effect of presenting a picture of God that is personal and real and relatable and engaged and involved. Not always in ways we would understand or even like, but nonetheless, still that. As to what went wrong, there's a disobedience that Genesis describes. It's rooted in some form of a desire on the part of the earliest humans for more, something else. And it took place as part of the origin story of humanity through the eyes of Genesis. There's a nuance to that, however, that I failed to mention previously, by which I mean a nuance to the disobedience and the desire for more. Because the decision Genesis tells us that the first humans made to disobey the divine voice was also rooted in a seed of mistrust of the divine. Specifically, a mistrust that God, in fact, wanted their good, their best. There was a mistrust that was sown like a virus into a hard drive by the posing of a question. Why is God holding back? Why doesn't God want you to be more like gods yourselves? And as a result, there was suspicion and doubt, an inner thought, there's more. Why won't God let me have it? And where does that suspicion come from? The mythic narrative of Genesis includes a deceitful, cunning creature in the form of a serpent, a sort of spiritual hacker that got around the firewall and planted the virus. That creature, whoever or whatever it is, was also made by God, according to Genesis, which begins to beg another question about what went wrong. How did that creature get that way? And why would God make a world in which there could be a creature that deceives, and a world in which humans are able to be deceived? Genesis doesn't answer that, and spoiler alert, neither do any of the books of Moses. Well, what about the fix? There's kind of a dual answer in Genesis that I noted in prior episodes. There's judgment, including instances of judgment that are actually outright extermination. And yet there's also instances of grace and the promise of blessing for all of humanity. It's the same God in the eyes of Genesis that orders the extermination of all but a few humans in the flood and promises at the same time the blessing of all humans in and through Abraham. And just to give one example of this kind of dual thread running through Genesis, begging the question, do these two aspects of the divine nature, as seen through the eyes of the books of Moses, fit together? And if so, how? I intimated in the last episode that there's much in this picture of God and reality and the fix, as presented in Genesis anyway, that I really struggle with, especially in light of the way that the Buddha and Jesus, as presented in John, understand reality and the nature of divine reality in the case of John, and what's wrong and how to fix it. And that raises a question, for some at least, about my friendship with Moses. How can I count him, or these books of Moses, as a friend if we actually disagree on some of the most fundamental things? So let me talk a little bit about my friend Moses. Much of my friendship with Moses has to do with the personality that emerges in the books of Moses. Now, that doesn't mean that I agree with everything he does or all of his decisions, just as I don't with all of my friends. Nor do I think that he was always hearing the divine voice correctly. Nor do I think everything happened actually in these accounts exactly, literally, as the story tells them. But there is a personality that comes through the texts, and the more I get to know that Moses, the man, the more I find myself feeling a deep affinity, a sense of sympathy and connection as a human being, because I can see myself in him. Now, that's especially true in the book of Exodus and the earlier chapters of Exodus. And that book opens with glimpses into his earliest experiences as a child, including from the moment of his conception. That brings us to Exodus chapter 2, and here are the first two verses of that portion. Now, a man from the house of Levi, one of the tribes of Israel, went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. Remember, the situation in Egypt is that there's an edict out to kill any newborn male among the Israelites. This narrative is so brief, so bare, so sparse, and yet if we imagine our way into the scene, those two verses are like rippling with electricity, the electricity of fear and anxiety, terror. From the prior episode, you'll recall again that up to this point, and prior to this point, Pharaoh has ordered all Egyptians to be looking for, listening for the birth of Israelite males. Under that edict, Israelite couples like Moses' parents, if we put our imagination into this, if we put ourselves empathetically into the scene, would be understandably afraid to have a child. They'd be afraid to conceive. They'd be afraid to be intimate as a couple. They would have those desires, and we can imagine the emotional atmosphere in their times of intimacy. Do we dare? What if? And once they do conceive, a more specific fear emerges. What if it's a boy? Then imagine the birth of this particular child, who turns out to be a male. More fear. What if this becomes known? More accurately, what happens when it becomes known? For it is sure to get out. Babies are not silent. This child will make noise. Imagine being a parent in that setting, and imagine being the child. Imagine what Moses is experiencing from the moment of conception. Children absorb these things not just at birth, but in the womb. Imagining myself as that child opened me in many ways to new dimensions of my own inner child, my own life before birth from my conception. And it's been one of the main sources of my sense of affinity with Moses and why I count him as a friend. I feel I can understand him. I have my own versions of what I assume he must have been feeling: fear, anxiety, hopelessness, a deep subconscious awareness of the uncertainty of his very existence, a deep sense that it's better to be silent and to hide, live in one's own world. There would have been, I believe, mixed feelings in his mother. The normal feelings of any mother who discovers they're pregnant, but also the feelings of a mother in this setting: I wish I wasn't. Which, of course, translates for the child in the womb who can't understand the bigger context: feelings of being unwanted. The unintended message from the mother in the womb is, I wish you didn't exist. And that begins in the womb. It continues for Moses at birth and into the early months of that child's life in a setting like this. The messaging becomes, don't speak too loud, don't play, don't laugh, don't cry, don't have a tantrum. These things leave deep scars. All of this leaves me with a sense of compassion for this friend, Moses. He does things later, as we'll see, that I think are huge mistakes. He will murder. He'll make decisions and establish laws that, when I look at them through the eyes of the Buddha and Jesus, seem completely inhumane and unjust. Stay tuned for that. But everybody has a story. Everyone has a history that's brought them to the moment in which we meet them on a particular day in a particular encounter. And at least one chapter in all of our stories is the chapter that tells us the story of the child still alive inside all of us. And so behind the things Moses says and does later in his life, I see the child that was conceived and raised in the setting of Exodus chapter 2. That's not a way to excuse Moses, or anyone for that matter, for things they do later, but it's still important to hold him and others and ourselves, myself, with compassion. But I've actually barely scratched the surface of that child's story. The day comes when his parents could no longer keep him hidden. And so the text continues, starting with verse 3. When she, the mother of Moses, could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket, covered it over with tar and pitch. She put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile, with her maidens walking alongside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and yes, the child was crying. She had pity on him. It's a really important word. She had pity on him. And the word is rooted actually not just to something like compassion or mercy, but actually to rescue. It's a word linguistically linked to the term rescue. So she not only feels a certain sense of compassion, but it's a compassion that leads to action. So the text again says, she had pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. His sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, should I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women that she may nurse the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go ahead. So the child went and called the nurse's mother. And then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I'll give you wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. The child grew. Then she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses and said, because I drew him out of the water. Now, there's a lot happening here. Let's start with when his mother could hide him no longer. Okay, now what? She faces an impossible dilemma. If he's discovered, the Egyptians will kill him, probably in a bloody, merciless way, and possibly in front of her very own eyes. It's also likely that the parents would have faced consequences for hiding the boy. They had two other children who depended on them, an older sister and an older brother, the latter being born before the edict. So, as with so many mothers throughout the bloody history of human oppression of other humans, Moses' mother decides on a terrible alternative. She takes his sister with her, and together they put him in a basket and they set him afloat on the river. Now, we can imagine maybe the conversation between the mother and the daughter here. How does a mother even begin to explain something like this to a child? And what could she possibly be expecting to happen? She had to know that the most likely outcome was going to be that he would die. Maybe of heat, thirst, hippopotamus, crocodile. Perhaps her thought was, well, at least no one who loved him would need to see it happen. So she and her daughter set off to do this terrible act of what? Act of love? Self-preservation, perhaps? Imagine the guilt, the burden of that decision. The text suggests that the mother leaves after putting the basket out on the river. It's the sister who stays and watches. Maybe the mother just simply couldn't bear to watch. But the sister stays to see what will happen. And what must she be feeling about Moses, towards her mother, her father, herself? And speaking of the father, where is Moses' father in all of this? Why does the mother bear the terrible weight of all of this? Why does the sister have to share it? And of course, perhaps by then the father had passed, but it begs the question. And of course, what's happening inside that basket? Which is a way of asking what's happening inside of Moses. How does a child even process this sort of thing? Well, they internalize it. And that means that Moses would have assumed that all this was happening due to something at fault in him. And by all this, I mean everything, not just the event at the river. All the fear, the anxiety, the pressure to keep quiet, the mixed emotions of his parents who wanted but didn't want him, and now the terror of being closed up in a dark basket alone and rejected, because how else could it feel, confirming his earliest feelings of being unwanted and alone. Now his sister is watching all this as the basket drifts, not out into the wild river as it happens, but to the place where women are bathing, Egyptian women, Pharaoh's own daughter, the daughter of the very man who has ordered the death of little boys like this little boy in the basket. Was this random? Did Moses' mother select this spot on purpose? The text doesn't tell us. Either way, if she selected the spot, then possibly it would have been with the hope that the daughter would have a compassionate heart. But then do what? Save him? Bring him home to raise him? That would rely on her willingness to go against her father's order. And of course, that's also the case if this is in fact random. Either way, things could go very badly, and everything depends on the decision of a young woman who's at the very center of Egyptian power. She decides to keep the boy. It's mentioned in a very matter-of-fact way, but it's actually a courageous act. It's obvious to her that this is a Hebrew child, she knows, and she had to be aware that bringing him home would create a scene of direct conflict with her father. As happens at various points in the first book of Moses, Genesis, as we've seen, the text is giving us another example of a virtuous foreigner, a virtuous Egyptian, an ally, a glimpse of how things can be among humans, even with our differences in language and religion and culture, and in this case also class. At any rate, her act of courage leads to another act of courage. The boy's sister steps up, takes initiative, and asks, might you be in need of a nursemaid? And so it happens that the boy is returned to his mother to be nursed and raised, which means that she will even be paid for nursing her own boy. And this is the point at which, if this were a legend or a fable, we would expect it to end with, and they all lived happily ever after. Except that isn't how it ends. Because the agreement made among these women requires that at a certain age the boy must be brought back to the palace, returned to Pharaoh's daughter, and thereafter be raised as her son, raised as an Egyptian. In other words, Moses' mother agrees to an arrangement that is going to require her to say goodbye all over again. I imagine how she must have felt during whatever period of time passed between the moment of this event and this agreement and the time when she would need to give Moses back. I imagine her counting down the months or weeks or days. Maybe it was years, I don't know. But eventually it would get down to hours and then minutes, and then the long walk to give the boy back, the attempts to explain to him what was happening, the tears, perhaps his screams, and a mother's heart breaking all over again. And I try to imagine what it's like for Moses as he absorbs all of this. And it's a mixed Moses. I want to say a mixed up Moses. Because there's another element in this whole story that might be easy to miss. It's implicit, it's not stated outright. But Moses is raised in his earliest years in a Hebrew home. And then during some of his most formative years and on into adulthood, he's raised Egyptian. Indeed, we're told that it's Pharaoh's daughter who gives him his name, and it's an Egyptian name. He's raised with what I would call a hybrid identity, a sense of self that is Hebrew and Egyptian. In the events that are about to take place, we'll see that confusing sense of self at play in events that will have a huge impact on his life, including another layer that is going to come into this hybrid identity. All of this is going to have a huge impact on the people of Israel and on the land of Egypt, and in fact, on the history of the world. Here we are in 2026 as I'm recording this, still talking about all this. As with so many turning points that have huge consequences in human history, family history, individual history, sometimes it starts with actions and decisions that don't seem to be hinges of history when they happen. We only see their significance later. Well, the next pivot here in Exodus comes in chapter 2, starting with verse 11. It came about in those days when Moses had grown up that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors and saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that, and when he saw there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He went out the next day, and behold, 2 Hebrews were fighting with each other, and he said to the offender, "Why are you striking your companion?" But the offender said, "Who made you a prince or judge over us? Are you going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian?" And then Moses was afraid and said, "Ooh, the matter has become known." When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. I'll pause the text there. Moses is going to become famous for, among several things, becoming a deliverer of his people out of bondage in the land of Egypt. In some ways, that future role and purpose is kind of on display here in miniature, in micro events of his life. But these first attempts at rescue end in what we can only call failure or at least disappointment. They don't turn out the way he was hoping. In one of those instances, Moses is angered by seeing one of his people, a fellow Hebrew, the people of his own ethnic identity, being mistreated by an Egyptian. Again, part of his identity. And filled with a sense of injustice, Moses intervenes and ends up killing the Egyptian. Now, in Moses' mind, it's a rescue, I think. It would seem that he has an innate sense of justice and of compassion for the mistreated. And this actually surfaces later, by the way, in laws he gives to Israel. But that's much later, not part of our story here. Stay tuned. As far as Moses is thinking, this incident is finished. He helped his people. He buried the Egyptian. No one knows. But he's wrong. People do know. The next day, he sees two of his people arguing, tries to settle their dispute, and instead of welcoming his intervention, they ask if he plans to kill one of them like he did the Egyptian. Moses has a moment of clarity. His action is known. His interventions are not welcome. The things he has done from instinct, from his nature as a person who seeks to deliver and help, have landed him in a very dangerous place. He was in some ways acting from an instinctive sense of his identity as a deliverer, a rescuer, and a leader. But his first attempts at being himself, we could say, have created a huge mess. The only response he can think of is to flee. So he leaves Egypt and is alone, vulnerable. And I can't help but wonder if these events serve to simply confirm what he's probably always felt about himself. I'm unwanted. I'm on my own. I should just keep quiet. And now at the age of 40, according to tradition anyway, it's not in the text, but he has passed 40 years of his life, according to Jewish tradition. He ends up in a region that the text refers to as Midian. It's south of what is now Israel. It's on the Sinai Peninsula, and it's 250 or 300 miles from Egypt. That's a long way on foot. And it might suggest that he was traveling towards the land he might have known through his parents to be the area promised to Abraham. There's no evidence in the text to suggest it, but it might have been what was happening. At any rate, the events that take place next have deep significance in the whole story, including more immediate significance for Moses as a human being. Here he meets his wife, starts his family, finds a new life, and eventually is going to have an encounter that changes the course of human history. As Exodus continues, we're told that a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs of water to fill up the troughs of water to water their father's flock. And then there were shepherds who came and drove these women away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. Sound familiar? When they came to Reuel, their father, he said, "Why have you come back so soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds." Notice, they see him as an Egyptian. Pharaoh's daughter recognized him as Hebrew. These Midianite women recognize him as an Egyptian. He's got this mixed, strange identity. At any rate, they say this Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and what's more, he even drew the water for us and watered the flock. Their father said to his daughters, "Well, where is he? Why is it you've left him behind? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses was willing to dwell with the man, and I think here the text skips over a whole lot of things. He gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses as a wife. She gave birth to a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, "I've been a sojourner in a foreign land." Moses had left Egypt alone, fleeing for his life, vulnerable. He's a stranger, an alien, an immigrant, a refugee. Later in life, when he crafts laws to govern the people he'll lead, he includes laws that call for kindness and hospitality to such aliens and wanderers and refugees. And it's possible that those laws flowed out of his own experiences. In addition, as we've seen, he's carrying within himself this confusing mixture of identities. Is he an Egyptian? Is he an Israelite? And in this mixture of identities, there's Egyptian and Israelite culture, language, customs, and religious practices and traditions and histories and ancestors. After wandering for hundreds of miles, he finds a well and stops to rest and to drink. And he observes another case of mistreatment, just as he had done back in Egypt, and he intervenes. And as we've seen, the women talk about all of this with their father, and he ends up with a family. But I want to hover over this father figure, because this is actually Moses' third father. He had a birth father, about whom the text tells us next to nothing. He's absent. Where was he when Moses was placed in that basket and sent to the river to die, as we've asked before? And the text gives us no name for this father, as well as no actions. He's largely just a non factor in the story. Moses also had an adopted father. He was taken into Pharaoh's family. And again, we know very little. The text suggests that it was Pharaoh's daughter who raised Moses, but Pharaoh would have been a very real presence, quote unquote, in the household, a father figure, if not officially or even day to day, but psychologically hovering like a shadow in the background. What we do know of him was that he was controlling, brutal, and ruthless. It's Pharaoh who issues the kill order, as we know, on Moses and all the other children, but then later on Moses, after finding out that Moses had intervened between the Egyptian and the Israelite. And all of that led to Moses' flight to Midian, where he now meets his third father figure. He has a father-in-law. This Midianite man is named in two different ways at various points in the text. Reuel here in this story, Jethro later in some other accounts. But what I notice is that he's named. We know the title of Pharaoh, but not his name. We're not told the name of Moses' birth father. Later tradition adds it, but it's not in the text. But this man is named, suggesting to me at least a closer relationship perhaps. And if so, it was not until Moses turns 40 that he experiences what we might call a real father. And what did Moses receive from him? Jethro, or Reuel, was a priest in the Midianite religion, and I think we should assume that much of what Moses learned about the religious ceremonies and practices we find later in the books of Exodus and Leviticus, he may have learned from this man. In addition, later in the book of Exodus, after the people have come out from Egypt and are encamped in the wilderness, it's Jethro, his father-in-law, who advises and counsels Moses as a leader in a particularly challenging situation. Exodus chapter 18 recounts how Jethro offers his counsel and does so with gentleness, open-handedness, respect, saying in effect, look, this is how I see it, Moses. If you think that if you do it this way, it's going to go well, that's great. But see what you think. So 3 father figures in Moses' life: the absent father, the cruel, harsh, controlling father, and a wise, mentoring father. Fathers, or father figures, are typically some of the most important people in our lives, even when, and maybe especially when, they're absent. They shape our sense of who we are and whether we've succeeded or failed. In part due to this, they're also often crucial in shaping our sense of self, who we are, our identity, rightly or wrongly, helpfully or harmfully. When I speak of Moses as my friend, this is one of the things that I have bonded with him around. My own experiences with my own fathers, plural. I mentioned that we know the name of only one of the 3, which caused me to notice something else. Moses' mother is also not named, nor is his adoptive mother, Pharaoh's daughter. What might this say about Moses' sense of relationship with his past? These books of Moses never claim that Moses himself is the author, the later tradition does. And so I'm not saying that they claim to reflect exactly his memory or experience of the events, but as I would do with any well-crafted novel, I'd be assuming the author, whomever that may be, is consciously or subconsciously including these details to help paint the picture and help portray the character of the persons whose story they are telling us. And the psychological portrait I see here is of a man who was raised with only a thin veneer of relational warmth. The picture that emerges is impersonal, shadowy, disconnected, distant. What follows next in the text is a segue. Moses was 40 when he fled from Egypt, according to tradition. That tradition also tells us he spent the next 40 years in Midian. As a result, the influences of this period of Moses' life, which I mentioned earlier, influences related to culture and religion and language, would have been extensive and deep, very extended within his whole psychological framework. That 40-year period is covered as the author takes our attention away from Moses and back to Egypt, back to the people of Israel, in a very brief segue. And in that segue, simultaneously, the text takes our attention to an entirely different realm altogether, the divine, to God. And so picking up at verse 23 of chapter 2, it says, "It came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them." Years have gone by, years of questioning and groaning and waiting. There's no answer as to why God waited, why the people had to suffer as he did so. This is more data, though, about the answer to the question, what is real? If, for the books of Moses, the answer to what is real is God, then this is a part of what God, or reality, is like, according to the books of Moses. There's something inscrutable in the character of the divine in the face of the facts of pain and suffering. It's all left unanswered. Indeed, there's no emphasis even in the text at all as to how to answer this. It just is. Artistically, however, the whole point of this little segue is to set up what is about to happen. Moses likely thinks his time in Egypt, his life as a hybrid Egyptian Israelite, is a season in his past, over, finished, except for the memories and the griefs and the regrets, all things that I'm sure that he must have been feeling and processing. It's yet another reason, by the way, for my own affinity and sense of personal connection with this friend Moses. But the fact that he might be thinking this could all be over, that whole season of his life, is in fact far from the case, as we will see next time.